actually spoke for the first time in several months. After speaking those words that his name is John, Zechariah began to sing of the Lord's goodness and praise his holy name. And so in the midst of singing, Zechariah adds some verses in Luke 1, 78 and 79, which we read a little earlier at the lighting of the candle of peace, and which we'll be looking at. And so in Luke 1, 78 through 79, Zechariah sings because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in the darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet onto the path of peace. May the Lord bless the reading of his holy word. Now these two verses help to take shape the direction we're going to go in, as well as what the candle of peace is here to remind us of each time we light it this Advent season. And as I mentioned earlier, this year we need even more peace because of what everything is going on. And by calling back to the peace that God has given to us, we'll be able to have a little more peace in our lives during the remainder of the year and the year to come. It is because of what God has done that we're able to have the path of peace. Now, to understand what it means to have the path of peace and to have peace, we must go back to where the peace came from. We must go back to the source of the peace, which is God the Father. Everything that we are, everything that we have, everything that we're going to be, all started with God. And so as we saw last week, that we saw that before the ages began, God promised. That God promised that one was going to come. That is the source in which we will go back to. And so when we always start our journeys, we must start with God. And Zechariah highlights this in these two verses that we have looked at. Luke 1, 78 and 79. For when we go back and we look at how Zechariah describes what we are getting, is because of God's tender mercy towards us. The tender mercy of God. Now the word tender is key here. And is understood by us to be the showing of gentleness and concern. We sometimes refer to this as sympathy. Now, the problem that I have with the word sympathy, it doesn't sound like something very sympathetic, but it also doesn't seem like something that would describe God. You know, do I believe that God is sympathetic? Absolutely. But sympathetic only kind of has the notion of just like you're just appeasing the hearer, really. You're just there trying to comfort them by saying, oh, I understand what you're going through. I am sympathetic. It just seems like something is missing there. So when we look at what was recorded for us in the Gospel of Luke, and we look at it in Greek, the Greek word for tender is defined as bowels. Yep, that's right, bowels. You heard me right. I'm not making a joke. This is what it really translates to. It translates to the bowels, as in the internal organs, the heart, the lung, the liver, the stomach, etc. The inward parts. So when we're talking about the tender mercy of God, we're talking about gut-level emotion. Deep inness of God. In fact, even in Hebrew, if you were to look back in the Old Testament and you were to find, everybody calls David the man, God called David a man after his own heart. Well, even when you look at in Hebrew, when you read about David being a man of God, being a man after God's own heart, it literally is meaning in Hebrew the same thing, that David is a man after the bowels of God. That God's tender mercy is deep-seated within him. That you cannot take mercy out of God because it is vital to who he is. So just like we saw with Hope last week, where we understood that God does not lie because he is the embodiment of truth. There's no deceitfulness or lies that exist within him. We understand that God's great mercy, which has made possible the path of peace, comes from a deep place within God's being. It is contained within the vital parts of God. It comes from a deep place because God is a deep, loving, and compassionate God who has significant and deep concern for us, to the point where it affects the internal organs. And so we know that God has great compassion for us because we read Psalm 25 verses 6 and 7, and it says, "Remember, Lord, your great mercy and love, for they are from old." Or as the Apostle John wrote to us and described that God is love. It is because of his tenderness, the deep feelings that he has for us, the care of God, that care of what God has made, because of that care that God is showing to us, has made open the path of peace for us. And so Zechariah is singing about what God is about to, that God is full of compassion and mercy. He has deep feelings for everything and everyone. So the child that is to come is part of that John is the one who's going to prepare the way of the Lord for. And we see that God's deep compassion has been on full display when we read John 3:16 and 17. Which is, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn, but to save the world through him." You see, when you read John 3:16 and 17, you really get a sense of how deep and compassionate that God's love is for us. How his mercy has been poured out, how it is part of his internal vital being. That God's very nature of mercy was being on full display as he cared for his children. We are his children. Because he sent his Son into the world. Not to condemn us, but to have eternal life.